Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching World War I, the Seminal Tragedy Part 4, the final act by Extra History. Now last time we saw the negotiations to stop this war basically break down. Today I imagine we will see the slide towards the war itself. As it says in the title, this is the final act. This is how we actually get to the beginning of World War I. Now, if you guys enjoy this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
The 24th of July, 1914. It's late at night. A group of haggard-looking men sit in a dim room in the ministry in Belgrade. One of them holds the Austrian ultimatum in his hands. They've spent the day debating how to reply. Defeated, they are about to give in to all demands. A notice slipped under the door. It says that the Russians have started to mobilize. They change their reply, and the final act begins.
Another one of those moments. Defeated. Perhaps they should just give in to Austria. But they hear word. Russia's beginning to mobilize. Russia has our backs. All right. Let's go forward with it. We're not going to give in. We're going to continue to resist this Austrian ultimatum, which they know will lead to war, or at least they can suspect that it will lead to war. And we talked about last time how a lot of that German-Austrian plan was based on Russia not being ready in time for war. Russia's already getting ready, man. We can all see which direction this is heading in.
In their reply, the Serbians agree to 9 out of 10 Austrian demands.
Yup.
They only refuse to allow Austrian officials to have police powers within Serbia.
It was only that last one. And so that really shows you how this ultimatum is a farce, just an excuse for Austria to go to war. Because if it wasn't, then Austria would have been more willing to negotiate versus saying, well, you accept 9 out of 10 clauses. Sorry, not good enough. We're going for you. It's like, really? And of course, that 10th was totally unacceptable. It would have broken Serbia's sovereignty. Of course they couldn't accept it, but they were willing to accept or at least talk about the other aspects of this ultimatum.
But their reply is a masterstroke, an act of genius in the way it concludes. For at the end, it says that if the Austrians don't find their terms to be fair, the Serbians are more than willing to submit to the resolution of a conference. But if you'll remember, the Austrians hate conferences. They are always getting outvoted at those things. Well, no more.
A big change from back in the day. Austria used to be this diplomatic powerhouse in Europe, but those days are long past. And so, we talked about last time how that Austrian ultimatum, sort of the point is to make them look good to the rest of Europe, to justify the war they're about to start. Serbia very intelligently sort of flips it on them.
Not this time. They are livid at the Serbian reply, but like always, they turn to their German allies for advice. The Kaiser is still at sea, so Austria's foreign minister Berthold goes to consult Bethmann Hollweg and Moltke, the head of the German army. They're apoplectic. They say, what, you haven't declared war already? A month has gone by, get on with it. This isn't what we agreed to. We're losing the sympathies of the people of Europe. You see, after the assassination of the Archduke, public opinion in Europe weighed heavily against Serbia. It was politically impossible for anybody to support them then. But now a month has passed, and this reply, this meeting of most of the Austrian demands, and this offer for mediation made the Serbs seem like the reasonable party.
Yes, and I mentioned this last time. As more time passes, now a month has passed, several parts of this plan are falling apart. First of all, that original Austrian plan was predicated on them getting in there quickly, punishing Serbia quickly, keeping the conflict contained, not getting Russia involved, not getting anybody else involved. That's falling apart. Secondarily, as we mentioned, there was a lot of sympathy with Austria because people saw the assassination of the Archduke as unjustifiable, and people were looking at Serbia, who a lot of people thought were involved, as the villains of this story. But now all this time has passed, Austria has sent them this ultimatum, which is clearly unfair, and the Serbs have responded pretty reasonably. Well, popular opinion starts to shift, and now the conditions are not nearly as favorable to Austria as they were a month ago.
After all, what more could Austria want? So, with the rebukes of the Germans driving him, Berthold returns to Austria-Hungary, and for the first time speaks with Konrad von Hötzendorf, the chief of staff of the Austrian army. He too is apoplectic. What, declare war? Are you kidding me? You needed to tell us weeks ago if that's what you wanted to do. The Austrian army won't be ready for war until the 14th of August, weeks from now. Plus, we don't even know who we're mobilizing against. You want us to prepare for war with Serbia? Yeah, not when Russia's mobilized against us, we aren't.
Yeah, Russia's already began partial mobilization. Y'all are not ready.
Get us a guarantee of Russian neutrality, and then maybe we can talk about mobilizing against the Serbs. Despondent, pressured toward war by the Germans, told that Austria isn't ready by his own chief of staff, Berthold returns home and begins to think. As the hours grow later, he starts to convince himself. There's a way out of this. He starts to reason that declaring war isn't necessarily the same as being at war, and
once again, this is why this story is so crazy. Last time, we really did reach the point of no return. We're past it. And yet, even being past the point of no return, some individuals like Bertel are now like, well, what if we don't go through with this? What if we change course? It's like, it is late, man. It is late in the process.
So maybe if he declares war now, he'll placate the Germans and be able to use that threat to get the Serbs to capitulate before he even needs the Austrian army to be ready to fight. Now, we can all see this for the desperate rationalization that it is.
Yeah.
We've all at one time or another gotten ourselves into an impossible situation and let ourselves believe in some wild, harebrained solution that'll surely fix everything.
This is true, but, when I start my paper too late for a deadline, the consequences are much more minor than what is happening here.
Only when we do that, the fate of the world isn't usually hanging in the
Exactly.
balance. And so, on the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, with Berthold all the while believing he's going to bring peace by declaring war. But that morning, the morning of the 28th, Kaiser Wilhelm II got back to Potsdam.
Here we go.
That very morning, the Kaiser read the Serbian response to the Austrian ultimatum and uttered, "With this, every reason for war drops away." And here is one of the great tragedies of
Rare piece of wisdom from our Kaiser here.
those frantic July days leading to the war. This man, Wilhelm II, for all his inadequacies, for all his failings, for once in his life steps up and tries to become the man he should be.
It actually is shocking, And to be fair, this does not absolve him of responsibility. Wilhelm has been an aggressor for these past couple of decades. He has frankly created, not only by his own hand, but partially by his hand, a lot of the conditions, the tension, the militarism that has led up to this point. So he's absolutely not absolved of responsibility. But in this case, he's actually not the most aggressive party. Rare.
The man who deserves to rule the most powerful nation in the world. And he comes so close. And yet, despite his best attempt, he's too late. The world doesn't reward his effort, things spiral into chaos, war comes, and his empire will fall. The Kaiser tries to open peace talks, perhaps even hold a conference, but the Austrians will have none of it. So he proposes a novel solution: halt in Belgrade. Belgrade, the Serbian capital, is just a few miles from the Austrian border. If the Austrian army occupies the capital, they can declare victory and save face, while showing the rest of Europe that they don't plan to annex Serbia.
Now, these are ideas to try and contain the war, but we can already see how it's totally out of their control. We've gone from, no war. This ultimatum has been sent. The point of the ultimatum was to get Austria into the war. Now we're already at the point where it's like, okay, well, we're going to war, but how do we contain the war? It's like, oh no, this is unraveling as we speak. It's totally out of control.
And they can do it quickly enough to perhaps keep the Russians out of the war.
But perhaps there's still a way to contain it, right? And if you're in a position of power at that point, yeah, absolutely, you should still be trying to work to contain this, even if it is out of control. And some people do still work to contain it up until the point when it's really not feasible.
But this proposal has to go through Bethmann, and Bethmann's in Berlin. Now get this, it's 1914, so as impossible as it seems, there was no telephone line between Berlin and Potsdam, so Bethmann can't reply directly. He's pretty skeptical of the halt in Belgrade plan, but instead of making the drive to Potsdam for clarification, he passes it along to German agents in Austria with the instructions not to press the Austrians too hard to adopt it. And he doesn't even mention that it comes from the Kaiser himself. Meanwhile, in Russia, Sazonov...
Yeah, that's a lot less convincing than, this personal recommendation from the Kaiser himself that you should definitely follow. The way it's being presented here is a lot more under the table, a lot less pressure, when it's sort of like, well, you want to make it clear to Austria how important this is.
Gets reports of Austrians shelling Belgrade. These reports are false, of course. The Austrian army won't be ready to do anything until August 14th, but he has no way of knowing that. So he, one of the last men opposed to full Russian mobilization, lets the dam break and declares himself for a full mobilization of the Russian army. He and the Russian chief of staff, Yanushkevich, go to see the Tsar and
And I would say, in many ways, what happens here, in some ways, parallels the events leading up to this. In the time leading up to World War I talked about that building tension between these countries, these very militarized European countries competing with each other on the world stage, especially after the German Empire was created, and we have this arms race. Well, I'm going to build these ships for my navy, and then the other country goes, okay, well, I have to do that too. I'm going to build more ships. I'm going to create all this artillery. All right, well, I have to do that too. And here we see this thing of, okay, well, it looks like y'all are going to war, so we're going to partially mobilize. Okay, well, you've partially mobilized, so now we have to prepare for war. Oh, I see you're preparing. Let us fully... And, you see a sort of arms race, maybe not specifically, but in a way, right? Everything just keeps escalating and escalating and escalating, and each side just sees themselves as responding to the escalation of the other side.
Convince him that the time has come. General mobilization is ordered. Night falls. It's 1 a.m., and the Tsar can't sleep. He sends a telegram to the Kaiser of Germany, and it reads thus. I'm glad
we're getting into this. I mentioned this in the last episode. I was pretty sure they'd bring it up, but here we go.
You're back. In this serious moment, I appeal to you to help me. An ignoble war has been declared to a weak country. The indignation in Russia shared fully by me is enormous. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Nikki.
So we have these series of messages, I believe letters and telegrams, sent between the Kaiser of Germany and the Tsar of Russia, and they refer to each other as Willie and Nikki. This is the last personal appeal to be made, and of course, if we remember, a lot of these royals throughout Europe are related. I mean, there's been a lot of inbreeding within European aristocracy for a long time, but a lot of these guys in particular are related because Queen Victoria is their granny or their aunt or something. Queen Victoria really gave birth to a whole generation of European royalty. They get together at family gatherings. They are close. Maybe not the best friends of all time, but they're family, right? And now, after the diplomacy is sort of already fallen over, the Tsar goes to the Kaiser just personally, as family, and says, basically he says, look, I can't necessarily turn back because what you're doing to Serbia, or what is being done to Serbia by Austria, is unfair. And, all of Russia feels this way, but, I fear this is getting out of control. Basically trying to come to some sort of solution.
Now you have to remember that these two men were cousins.
Yeah.
They were friends. All the avenues of diplomacy had failed. All the standard bureaucratic mechanisms of the state were driving them to war, so they reached out to one another as cousins and as friends to see if the two of them, dealing directly person to person, could avoid this war.
Yep.
And in a touch that could only come from these twilight days of empire, did they not refer to each other as Tsar or Kaiser? They don't even refer to each other as Wilhelm and Nicholas, but rather as Willie and Nicky.
It really is, it's remarkable. All the official channels of diplomacy have fallen apart. And so now we have these two aristocrats, these two royals, sort of these institutions from another era, these institutions that are about to fall, reminds you of the medieval ages, now communicating with each other on a personal level to try and solve this problem after all other of these modern bureaucratic institutions have totally fallen. And of course, this isn't going to work either, but it's very interesting and sort of sad, to see these letters between them, see that personal connection, and then know what is still going to happen.
The Kaiser is awake too, and he responds. A flurry of telegrams get sent back and forth. At the end of these correspondences, Nicholas picks up the phone, calls Yanushkevich, and tells him to call off the general mobilization. Yanushkevich splutters and starts to reel off all the things that canceling mobilization means they're going to have to do, but the Tsar says, cancel it, and hangs up the phone. On the morning of the 30th, Sazonov hears what the Tsar has done. He's shocked. He pulls in the head of the Duma, the Russian parliament, and the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, and they go in for a knockdown, drag-out meeting with the Tsar. The room is crowded, it's hot, talks are getting nowhere, and then Nicholas moves off alone.
Another case where, because of course the war is going to go forward, so we know something's going to change, but, we saw in Germany, for once, the Kaiser actually became a voice of reason, rare for him, and in Russia, Nicholas, who I do think he's a little less aggressive than his German counterpart, but also not known as a great leader, kind of indecisive and vacillating, and that may come into play here. Nicholas is also providing somewhat of a voice of reason. He's trying to call this off. He's trying to stop this conflict, but of course he's not gonna.
Staring out the window at St. Petersburg, trying to think. After a few minutes of reflection, coming to no conclusion, a young man, an aide-de-camp, standing near the Tsar, says, "Majesty, we know how difficult it must be for you to decide." Without intention, these words cut. Nicholas had always been called a weak, indecisive, feckless leader.
Yeah, and I think there are some comparisons to be made between Wilhelm and Nicholas and others not. Like I said, I think Wilhelm was more aggressive, brash, that sort of thing. But neither were seen as fantastic leaders. Nicholas, because he was seen as indecisive and vacillating, always wanted to live up to the image of his father, always wanted to be that strong, conservative monarch that he really struggled to be, and this will really get him into trouble, not only here, of course, but at the end of his reign, and you can sort of start to imagine why those words might have bitten, how difficult it is for you to decide, and he's thinking, well, it's not difficult for me to decide, I am this impressive, God-chosen leader like my father. I can decide, and, well, there you go.
And he hated it. He wanted to shake off all those names people had been calling him for so many years. He wanted to show the world he wasn't some wishy-washy prince who couldn't make up his mind. And so, like that, with the words of some aide-de-camp whose name history has forgotten, Nicholas turns around and says, "I will sign the order."
There you go.
Back in Germany, Bateman's finally come around. They're starting to make progress with the Austrians on the Halt in Belgrade plan. The British have even said that this plan has their support. But Berthold won't accept it.
It's just never going to be enough.
Can't accept it unless the Russians agree to halt their mobilization. And here we hit the catch-22 of the First World War.
Yeah.
This is the age of the train, the period where logistics and timetables dominated military thinking. All around Europe, it was thought that if you could just get your army to the battlefield while the other guy's forces were still arriving, you'd crush them every time.
And this was the idea about Russia, right? The idea, sort of generally like they're saying, if you could mobilize first, you would win. And then the idea about Russia was that they were this big, lumbering country behind the times, not advanced, and it would take them ages to mobilize. I mean, very recently, before this, not even 10 years prior, Russia had been beaten by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War, and they were humiliated in front of all of Europe. And so the idea is that, well, Russia won't be able to mobilize fast. We will. So you can see sort of the broad idea and then the specific circumstances here. That's what people thought. Now, turns out those ideas were largely faulty.
You'd win without contest. And as we've seen with the Austrians, mobilization can take weeks. It is a Herculean task to coordinate and move the millions of men that made up a modern army. And if Russia acquiesces and has her army stand down, they will be impossibly behind. If they stop mobilization, and then Austria or Germany decide to attack, they'll have lost the war without even a fight. So Russia cannot stop mobilization.
Yep.
But if Russia mobilizes, that means Germany has to mobilize too.
Once again, it's this idea of the sort of arms race that I talked about in sort of the broader build-up to the war over the past couple of decades, as in a very literal arms race than the diplomacy leading to the conflict, where we're talking more metaphorically. And right here, we have sort of the similar issue of escalation, where it's like, well, I can't stop my mobilization, because then I won't be ready for war. And then you say, okay, well, if you can't stop your mobilization, then I definitely can't stop mine. And then, once again, we move closer and closer towards conflict.
Or face the same dilemma. And now with Germany mobilized, what can France do but mobilize themselves? After all, the Franco-Prussian War taught them a hard, bitter lesson about what happens when you get your army to the field too slowly.
Yeah.
And they will not be making that mistake again. And so the dominoes start to fall. But there's one last attempt. One last try to stop that crushing chain of causality leading the world inexorably to war. Portales, the poor German diplomat playing a bit part in a tragedy that he has the desire but not the means to avert, has one last meeting with Sazonov. He says to Sazonov, call off the general mobilization.
It's so sad because there are so many points at which people genuinely try to stop this. It's just never enough. It just doesn't work. The pieces don't come together, and it still happens.
And Sazonov says no. Portales pleads, for God's sakes, there will be no winner in this war. If we fight, it'll be revolution. It will be the end of monarchy. It'll be the end of us both.
Yeah, I mentioned last time, once again, drawing back to that last 100 years of European history after the French Revolution, which of course frightened the monarchies of Europe, and the extremely destructive Napoleonic Wars. They came together, these conservative monarchies of Europe, to create a system, this concert of Europe, this diplomatic system, where they could prevent a similar thing from happening. And now it's happening. A major European war is fomenting before them, and they worry about the death, the consequences, the revolutions that could occur. And of course, all of this is going to happen. It sounds prophetic, but he is drawing on real history from the past. He says, look, we know what the consequences will be. And he's exactly right.
Won't you please call off this madness? And Sazonov says, no. Portales drops to his knees and says, if you do this, it will be slaughter. I beg of you, in the name of all that is right and decent, call off this mobilization. And Sazonov says no. Then Portales rises to his feet and takes a piece of paper from his pocket and says, in that case, sir, I have the honor to inform you that we're at war. He's still struggling to collect himself, saying, never thought I'd be leaving Russia like this. I don't know how I'll be able to pack. Sazonov kindly offers to send somebody to help gather his things. And a month later, 1 million men are dead.
There you go.
The Seminal catastrophe has begun.
Jesus.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow.
Famous song.
Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky.
Jesus, man. I hope this music doesn't get blocked, by the way. Everything that had to happen to lead up to this almost seems inevitable. No history's inevitable, but Jesus.
Take up your quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow. In Flanders fields,
Wow. Wow. What an ending. It's such a tragic event, you know? We watched this whole series, and like I've said, so many things had to go a particular way to lead to this war. And you watch it, it almost feels inevitable, but it wasn't. There were people every step of the way trying to stop this conflict, and they just couldn't do it. And that's what it leads to. All that destruction, death, pain, not to mention the more long-term consequences. Wow, what an ending. I didn't expect it to end like that. And, the poppy, that's still a symbol of Remembrance Today. Some of my British viewers will know that. We don't really do the poppy so much in America, but that's still a common symbol today. Wow. Holy. That was a pretty remarkable series. The ending there, I thought a real sort of artistic way to bring it to a close. I think a good way to make you feel the tragedy that follows all of this. Goodness. Alrighty. Well, that's that. This was quite the series. A very narrativized series, as extra history series often are, but I think a very well-told story that really lets you feel the disaster that was the build-up to the war, and I think imparts upon you the very serious consequences that were to follow because of these failings. And not to mention, the interwar period and then World War II, a lot of which is, directly occurs because of the consequences of this conflict. So truly, the Seminal tragedy. Yeah, I think is a very fair way to put it, truly. Okay, wow. I had a good, but a bit of a sad time with this series. If you guys enjoyed, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, all of that stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. And I hope you're all having a good day today. I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.